She was just a waitress serving dinner until the Mafia Boss whispered, "Tonight, you're my wife." The clatter of silver against fine china died instantly as the mahogany doors slammed shut. Vivian froze, the heavy tray of champagne flutes trembling in her white-gloved hands. The VIP dining room, previously humming with the dangerous murmurs of the city's most feared men, fell into a suffocating, violent silence. A rival boss stood at the end of the long table, drawing a sleek weapon from his jacket. Before Vivian could scream, a tailored arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against a solid chest. Weston didn't even look at the gunman. His dark, cold eyes locked onto hers, his voice a terrifying velvet rasp that echoed through the paralyzed room. "Touch her, and you burn. Tonight, you're my wife." The evening had begun like any other soul-crushing Friday shift at Laura, the city's most exclusive and discreet fine dining establishment. Vivian stood in the cramped stainless steel kitchen, her low ponytail pulled tight, adjusting the uncomfortable stiff collar of her white uniform. Her feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that had become the permanent soundtrack to her life. At 24, she was drowning in the invisible weight of overdue rent, utility shut-off notices, and the lingering, crushing debt left behind by a father she barely remembered. She didn't have the luxury of quitting, even when the restaurant manager, a petty tyrant with a penchant for cruelty, assigned her to the private VIP rooms. "Keep your eyes on the tablecloth, pour from the right, and if you hear something that sounds illegal, you deafen yourself instantly," the manager had hissed, practically shoving the heavy silver tray of vintage Dom Perignon into her hands. "The men in the Obsidian Room tonight own the city. They own the police. They own me. Do not make a mistake, Vivian." Vivian had nodded, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. She pushed through the padded velvet doors, stepping out of the chaotic, brightly lit kitchen and into the dimly lit, opulent, hushed corridors of the restaurant's private wing. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of beeswax polish, roasted garlic, expensive leather, and the musky undertone of imported cigars. When she entered the Obsidian Room, the tension was already palpable, a living thing crawling along the floral-patterned wallpaper. At the head of the long, polished mahogany table sat Weston. Even without knowing his name or his title, Vivian could feel his authority. He was a man carved from marble and shadow. He wore a midnight blue suit that spoke of old money and bespoke tailoring, but there was a feral edge to the way he sat. He didn't lean back. He occupied the space, his dark, piercing eyes tracking every movement in the room with the lazy, terrifying grace of an apex predator. His jaw was locked, his hands resting lightly on the table, devoid of the flashy rings the other men wore. He exuded a quiet, lethal power that made the air around him feel 10 degrees colder. Vivian approached the table, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved like a ghost, just as she had been trained, pouring the golden liquid into crystal flutes without letting the glass touch the rim. As she stepped behind Weston to fill his glass, she caught the faint, intoxicating scent of bergamot and gun oil. It was a contradiction that made her breath hitch. For a fraction of a second, his dark eyes flicked up, meeting hers in the reflection of the silver serving dome on the table. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a calculating depth that made Vivian feel entirely transparent. She looked away instantly, her cheeks burning, retreating to the shadows against the far wall. For an hour, the dinner proceeded with a tense, terrifying civility. The men spoke in coded language, discussing shipments, territory, and handling the union problem. Vivian remained a statue, blending into the damask drapes. Then, the atmosphere fractured. The mahogany doors swung open without a knock. A group of 4 men entered, bringing the scent of the cold street and impending violence with them. The man leading them was older, his face scarred, his smile a cruel slash across his face. The men at the table stiffened, hands dropping below the tablecloth. Weston, however, did not move. He slowly picked up his linen napkin, dabbing the corner of his mouth before dropping it onto his plate. "You weren't invited to this table," Weston said, his voice smooth, low, and completely devoid of fear. "I don't need an invitation to claim what belongs to me," the scarred man replied, stepping deeper into the room. The guards stationed at the door had mysteriously vanished. The room was suddenly a powder keg, the fuse already burning. Vivian tried to shrink further into the corner, praying to become invisible. She gripped her empty silver tray to her chest like a useless shield. The conversation escalated rapidly, voices rising, accusations flying in rapid-fire bursts. The scarred man slammed his fist on the table, rattling the fine china. He was demanding a concession, a territory, or a life Vivian couldn't tell. Her ears were ringing with pure adrenaline. "You've grown arrogant, Weston." The scarred man spat. "You think you can hide the girl forever? We know she's in the city. We know the bloodline didn't end. Hand over the information, or this room becomes a slaughterhouse." Vivian's breath caught. The girl? She had no idea what they were talking about, but the sheer malice in the man's voice made her skin crawl. Weston's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The movement was fluid, controlled. "You have crossed a line," Weston said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a deadly resonance. "And you will find nothing but ghosts." The scarred man snarled, reaching into his jacket. The sound of metal scraping against a holster was deafening in the sudden quiet. A weapon was drawn, its dark barrel catching the low light of the chandelier. Vivian let out a small, involuntary gasp. It was a tiny sound, barely a whisper, but in the echoing silence of the standoff, it was like a gunshot. The scarred man's eyes snapped toward her, his gun hand twitching in her direction. In a fraction of a second, the world blurred. Weston moved with a speed that defied his size. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for her. His large, heavily calloused hand clamped around Vivian's wrist, pulling her forward with an unstoppable force. The silver tray clattered uselessly to the floor, rolling away. Before Vivian could process the terror, she was crushed against the hard lines of Weston's chest. His arm banded around her waist, an iron vice that held her suspended in the chaotic moment. The scent of bergamot and violence overwhelmed her senses. She was trembling violently, her wide, terrified eyes staring at the gun pointed squarely in their direction. Weston didn't even look at the weapon. His dark, cold eyes locked onto the scarred man, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute defiance. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the promise of bloodshed. Then, Weston spoke, his voice a terrifying velvet rasp that echoed through the paralyzed room, altering the course of Vivian's life forever. "Touch her and you burn. Tonight she's my wife." The word wife hung in the air, a physical weight that seemed to alter the gravity of the room. The scarred man's hand faltered, the barrel of his gun dipping a fraction of an inch. In the unspoken, draconian laws of the underworld, a boss's wife was sacred ground. To strike at a man's business was war. To strike at his wife was an invitation to an annihilation so complete. History would forget your name. Vivian couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt packed with cotton. The heat radiating from Weston's body was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She looked up at him, her lips parted in a silent plea for explanation, but his profile was carved from stone. He was entirely focused on the threat, using her body not as a shield, but as a declaration of absolute war if crossed. "You're lying," the scarred man hissed, though the absolute certainty had vanished from his eyes. "You don't have a wife. You're trying to protect the waitress. Pull the trigger and test my claim." Weston challenged softly, the quietness of his voice more terrifying than a scream. "See what remains of your family by sunrise." The standoff stretched, an agonizing eternity measured in rapid, shallow heartbeats. Vivian could feel the erratic thumping of her own heart against Weston's chest. The scarred man weighed the odds, the cost of the gamble. Slowly, with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, he lowered the weapon and slid it back into his jacket. "This isn't over, Weston," he spat, backing toward the door. "A title doesn't make her bulletproof forever." "Get out," Weston commanded, the words sharp as broken glass. The rival crew backed out of the room, the mahogany doors swinging shut behind them with a heavy final thud. The moment the latch clicked, the remaining men at the table sprang into action, drawing weapons, shouting into radios, securing the perimeter. Weston didn't relax. His grip on Vivian's waist remained unyielding as he turned, practically lifting her off the ground as he marched toward the private exit at the rear of the room. "What are you doing? Let me go." Vivian finally found her voice, a raspy, desperate whisper. She pushed against his chest, her hands meeting solid, unmoving muscle beneath the expensive wool of his suit. "Quiet," he ordered, not looking at her. He kicked open the rear door, leading them into a narrow, dimly lit service hallway. that smelled of bleach and damp brick. "No, I have to go back. My manager, my job." Weston stopped abruptly, turning to face her in the gloom of the corridor. His large hands gripped her shoulders, pinning her in place. His eyes were wild, a storm of calculated violence and something else she couldn't identify. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If you walk back into that dining room, you are a dead woman. The moment I claimed you, you became a target. They will take you, they will break you to get to me, and then they will discard you. Your life as a waitress ended 3 minutes ago." Vivian stared at him, tears welling in her eyes, blurring his harsh features. "Why?" she choked out. "Why did you say that? I don't even know you." "Because it was the only law he would respect," Weston replied, his tone chillingly pragmatic. "Now move. Unless you want to find out how quickly his patience wears off." He didn't wait for her to agree. He grabbed her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that bruised, and pulled her down the hallway. They burst through the heavy metal fire exit door, stepping out into the biting chill of the night air. The alleyway was dark, slick with recent rain, the neon signs from the main street reflecting in the puddles. A massive, black, armored SUV idled in the shadows, its engine a low, menacing growl. The rear door was already open, held by a man in a dark suit who scanned the rooftops with a submachine gun resting against his hip. Weston practically threw Vivian into the back seat, diving in immediately after her. "Drive. Compound." Now he barked at the driver before the door had even fully closed. The SUV surged forward, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt as it tore out of the alley. Vivian was thrown back against the plush leather seats, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The interior of the car was dark, the windows heavily tinted. Weston sat beside her, already on a secure phone, speaking in rapid, hushed tones, issuing orders for lockdowns, sweeps, and retaliatory positioning. Vivian curled into the corner of the seat, her knees pulled tight against her chest. Her pristine white uniform was wrinkled, a stark, absurd contrast against the tactical, heavily armored interior of the mob boss's vehicle. She was shivering uncontrollably, the adrenaline crashing through her system and leaving a terrifying, hollow void. "We have a tail," the driver announced, his voice tight. "2 sedans, black. Gaining fast." Weston ended his call, his eyes flashing to the rearview mirror. He reached under his seat, pulling out a heavy, matte black handgun. The metallic clack of him racking the slide made Vivian flinch violently, a small sob tearing from her throat. "Keep your head down," Weston ordered, his voice devoid of panic, purely clinical. He reached over, placing a heavy hand on the back of Vivian's head and pushing her down until her cheek pressed against the cold leather of the seat. The SUV swerved violently, the force throwing Vivian against Weston's leg. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the roar of the engine, the squeal of tires, and the terrifying, hollow thud-thud-thud of bullets striking the armored glass of the rear window. "Hold on!" the driver yelled. The heavy vehicle drifted through a sharp corner, slamming into something metallic, a dumpster, a parked car. Vivian couldn't tell. The impact rattled her teeth. Weston's body shielded hers, an immovable barrier between her and the violence outside. He wasn't firing back. He was focused entirely on keeping her pinned to the floorboards, his body curving over hers in a protective arc. For 10 agonizing minutes, the chase tore through the city's industrial district. Vivian lived entirely in the dark, her sensory world reduced to the smell of Weston's cologne, the deafening roar of the evasive maneuvers, and the terrifying realization that her ordinary, struggling life had been utterly obliterated. When the SUV finally slowed, turning onto a smooth, quiet road, the silence in the cabin was heavier than the gunfire had been. She was a captive in a war she didn't understand, claimed by a man who terrified her more than the bullets. The armored SUV slowed to a crawl, the heavy tires crunching over immaculate gravel. Vivian slowly pushed herself up from the floorboards, her muscles screaming in protest. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the edge of the leather seat. She peered through the tinted, bullet-pocked glass, her eyes widening at the sight before her. They had passed through a set of massive, wrought-iron gates, flanked by stone pillars and armed guards carrying assault rifles. The driveway wound through acres of manicured, impossibly dark woodland, leading up to a sprawling, modern compound of glass, steel, and dark stone. It looked less like a home and more like a high-tech fortress. a monument to wealth and absolute paranoia. The vehicle stopped beneath a sweeping portico. Weston opened his door before the driver could assist, stepping out into the cool night air. He didn't look back at Vivian immediately. He stood in the ambient light, speaking rapidly to a man who had rushed out of the front doors. Vivian sat frozen in the back seat. "Run," her mind screamed. "Open the opposite door and run into the trees." But her body wouldn't obey. Her legs felt like lead. She was 20 miles outside the city limits, wearing a waitress uniform, surrounded by heavily armed men. There was nowhere to run. A sharp tap on the glass made her jump. Weston had opened her door, his dark silhouette blocking the light from the entrance. He held out a hand. It was large, the knuckles slightly bruised, the white cuff of his shirt stained with a small streak of dirt or perhaps blood. "Get out," he said. It wasn't a request. Vivian hesitated, looking from his hand to his unreadable face. Slowly, defeated, she placed her small, trembling hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, and entirely possessive as he helped her out of the high vehicle. He didn't let go of her hand as he led her up the wide stone steps and through the massive double doors. The interior of the compound was staggering. It was a study in minimalist luxury, vast expanses of dark wood, polished concrete floors, and stark, dramatic lighting. Yet, despite the undeniable beauty, it felt cold. It felt like a beautifully designed prison. A severe-looking woman in her late 50s, wearing a dark dress, stood waiting in the expansive foyer. She bowed her head slightly as Weston approached. "Martha," Weston said, his tone authoritative but respectful. "This is Vivian. She will be staying in the East Wing guest suite. See that she is provided with whatever she needs. Nobody else is to approach her wing without my direct authorization." Martha's eyes flicked to Vivian, taking in her disheveled uniform and terrified expression. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked, crossed the older woman's features. "Of course, Mr. Rossi. Right away." Weston finally released Vivian's hand. He turned to face her, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. "Martha will take care of you. Do not leave the East Wing. Do not attempt to use the phones. They are locked down. I will come to you when I have secured the perimeter." "I want to go home," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking. It was a childish plea, but it was all she had left. "Please, I won't tell anyone what happened. Just let me go back to my apartment." Weston's expression hardened, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He stepped closer, invading her space until she had to tilt her head up to look at him. "You don't have an apartment anymore, Vivian," he said softly, the words dropping like stones into her stomach. "By now they have already sent men to your address. They have likely tossed your belongings and are waiting in the dark for you to return. The life you had this morning is gone." Tears finally spilled over Vivian's eyelashes, tracking through the faint dust on her cheeks. "Why are you doing this to me?" she choked out. "I'm just a waitress." Weston stared at her, his eyes tracing the line of a tear down her face. For a fleeting second, something that looked almost like regret softened his harsh features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a wall of impenetrable ice. "Because sometimes, survival requires a sacrifice," he said cryptically. "Go with Martha. Lock your door." He turned on his heel and strode down a long hallway, disappearing into the shadows of the massive house, leaving Vivian entirely alone in a world she didn't understand. Martha led her in silence through a maze of corridors, eventually opening a heavy oak door to a suite that was larger than Vivian's entire apartment building. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a dark, walled garden, a king-sized bed draped in heavy silk, and a marble bathroom that felt absurdly luxurious. "There are fresh clothes in the closet, miss," Martha said quietly, standing by the door. "Nightwear and daywear for tomorrow. I will bring a tray with food shortly." "I'm not hungry," Vivian said hollowly, wrapping her arms around herself. "You should eat, miss. You will need your strength," Martha replied, her voice gentle but firm. "And, if I may be so bold, do exactly as Mr. Rossi says. He is not a man who makes idle threats, but he is also the only reason you are currently drawing breath." With that chilling comfort, Martha stepped out, and the heavy door clicked shut. The sound of a lock engaging echoed with finality. Vivian walked slowly into the center of the room. She felt utterly numb. She moved to the massive bed, sinking onto the edge of the mattress. The silk felt wrong against her cheap polyester uniform. She was trapped. She was the fake wife of a mafia boss, locked in a gilded cage, with a target painted on her back by a rival syndicate she didn't even know existed. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms, and finally allowed herself to break down. The massive, silent house swallowed the sound of her sobs, indifferent to the waitress who had been dragged into the abyss. Daylight brought no relief. It only illuminated the stark reality of her confinement. Vivian woke up with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs, disoriented by the heavy silence and the sheer scale of the room. For a brief, blissful second, she thought the previous night had been a stress-induced nightmare. Then, she felt the cool, high-thread count sheets beneath her hands and saw the vaulted ceiling. The memory of the gunshot, the car chase, and Weston's cold declaration crashed over her like a physical blow. She pushed herself up, her body aching from the tension. She was still wearing the clothes she had found in the closet the night before. A pair of impossibly soft, dark silk pajamas that hung loosely on her frame. The tray of food Martha had left remained untouched on a side table. The tea now stone cold. Vivian walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view was breathtaking but terrifying. Beyond the manicured gardens, a high stone wall topped with discreet but very real security cameras encircled the property. In the distance, she could see the dark tree line. Men in dark clothing, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders, patrolled the perimeter with chilling precision. She wasn't just hiding. She was in a heavily fortified military encampment. She needed answers. She couldn't sit in this beautiful room waiting for a mafia boss to decide her fate. Moving to the massive walk-in closet, she bypassed the racks of designer dresses and found a simple pair of dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that fit her passably well. Dressing quickly, she approached the heavy oak door. She expected it to be locked, but the handle turned smoothly beneath her grip. Weston had said not to leave the East Wing, but he hadn't locked her in. It was a test. Or perhaps he knew she had nowhere to go. She stepped out into the quiet hallway. The air was still, smelling faintly of lemon polish and expensive coffee. She walked softly, her bare feet making no sound on the thick runner rug. As she approached the central hub of the house, the low hum of voices reached her ears. She pressed her back against the wall, creeping closer to an open archway that led to what looked like a massive, high-tech command center. Screens covered one wall, displaying security feeds from across the city. Weston stood in the center of the room, his jacket off, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up, exposing heavily tattooed forearms. He looked exhausted, his hair slightly disheveled, but his posture was as rigid as ever. Next to him stood a younger man with sharp features and a dangerous, wolfish grin. "The Bianchi family is tearing the port apart," the younger man was saying, tapping a tablet. "They're burning through their own resources trying to find the girl. They still don't believe she's here. They think your stunt at the restaurant was a diversion." "Let them think it," Weston replied, his voice a low rumble. "Keep the perimeter tight. If a Bianchi soldier so much as breathes near the city limits, I want him buried before he exhales." "You took a massive risk pulling her out like that, boss," the younger man said, his tone dropping, becoming more serious. "Declaring her your wife. That binds you. The commission will require proof. They will demand to see her. If they find out she's a nobody, a waitress you used to block a bullet, they'll authorize a hit on both of you for breaking the covenant." Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they could hear it. The commission. A hit. Proof. Weston turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "She is not a nobody, Elias. And she is not a prop. Then what is she, Weston?" Elias pushed back, crossing his arms. "Because from where I'm standing, you just started a war over a girl who poured our drinks." Weston's silence was heavy, loaded with secrets he refused to share. "She is my wife," he said finally, the words ringing with absolute chilling finality. "That is the reality we live in now, and anyone who questions it will deal with me." Vivian couldn't listen anymore. She stepped out from behind the archway, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Both men snapped their attention to her. Elias's hand instinctively dropped to his waist, while Weston simply stared, his expression unreadable. "I am not your wife," Vivian said, her voice shaking but louder than she expected. "And I demand to know what is going on. Who are the Bianchis? Why are they looking for a girl? Why did you drag me into this?" Elias looked from Vivian to Weston, a slow, amused smirk spreading across his face. Well, she's got fire. I'll give her that. Leave us, Elias, Weston commanded softly. Elias nodded, offering Vivian a mock salute before disappearing down another corridor. Weston walked slowly toward Vivian. He stopped just a few feet away, towering over her. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of a sleepless night spent orchestrating violence. You were told to stay in your room, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I am not a prisoner, Vivian retorted, though she felt exactly like one. You kidnapped me. You claimed me as property in front of a man with a gun. I want the truth. If I'm going to die because of your lie, I deserve to know why. Weston reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he slowly tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence he commanded. You are not going to die, Vivian, he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. Because the lie is now the truth. Tomorrow night, we attend the syndicate gala. You will walk in on my arm. You will smile. You will play the part of the devoted, fearless woman who tamed the monster. If you do that, you live. If you falter, if you show fear, the sharks will smell blood, and not even I will be able to stop them from tearing you apart. He stepped back, his expression hardening back into stone. Your training begins now. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Rossi. The next 36 hours were a blur of surreal, terrifying preparation. Vivian felt like a porcelain doll being painted and dressed for a macabre play where a single missed line meant execution. A team of discreet, silent professionals descended upon her suite. Tailors measured her with frantic precision, seamstresses pinned expensive fabrics against her skin, and stylists analyzed her hair and makeup with clinical detachment. Through it all, Weston was a ghost. A looming presence felt in the sudden silence of the staff whenever he passed her door. But he never entered. He had left her to be molded into the lie he had created. It was late afternoon on the day of the gala when the reality of her transformation truly set in. Vivian stood before the massive gilded mirror in her bedroom. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her unruly hair had been tamed into sleek, elegant waves cascading over one shoulder. The makeup highlighted her cheekbones and gave her eyes a dark, smoky intensity she had never possessed, but it was the dress that stole her breath. It was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk, cut low in the back and clinging to her curves like liquid glass. It screamed of wealth, power, and dangerous elegance. It was the armor of a mob boss's wife. It fits perfectly, miss, Martha said softly from the doorway, holding a velvet jewelry box. Mr. Rossi requested you wear these tonight. Martha opened the box, revealing a breathtaking diamond and emerald necklace that looked heavy enough to bruise her collarbone. Vivian stared at it, a wave of nausea washing over her. The necklace wasn't a gift. It was a collar, a brilliant, blinding collar marking her as Weston's property. I can't wear that, Vivian whispered, stepping back from the mirror. It's too much. This whole thing is insane. You must, Martha replied firmly, stepping forward and deftly fastening the heavy, cold stones around Vivian's neck. In his world, weakness is blood in the water. You must look untouchable. Seeking a moment of quiet before the impending storm, Vivian slipped out of her suite. The house was a hive of activity. Security details coordinating routes and protocols for the evening. She wandered toward the west wing, seeking the quiet library she had glimpsed earlier. The corridors here were darker, the afternoon sun failing to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. She turned a corner and froze. A man was standing near a side entrance, holding a small, unlit flashlight. He wasn't wearing the standard dark suit of Weston's guards. He wore the uniform of the catering staff hired for the pre-gala preparations. But the way he stood, the coiled tension in his muscles, was entirely wrong. He heard her heels click on the marble and spun around. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her appearance, then narrowed into a predatory squint. He reached into his apron. Vivian's instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous city streets at night, screamed at her. Weapon. She spun around, her high heels slipping on the polished floor, and bolted back the way she came. Hey! Wait! The man hissed, lunging after her. The heavy silk of her dress tangled around her legs. She pushed through a set of double doors. Finding herself in a dark, unused dining room, she frantically searched for an exit, but the man burst through the doors behind her, cutting off her escape. He drew a suppressed pistol, the long, dark cylinder terrifying in the dim light. "Don't scream," he whispered, stepping closer. "The Bianchis send their regards. They want to know exactly who you really are." Vivian backed up until her spine hit the heavy oak dining table. She couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs had turned to ash. This was it. The lie had failed. The man raised the gun, aiming it at her chest. "Walk toward me, slowly. We're taking a little trip." Before Vivian could move, before she could even process the demand, a shadow detached itself from the far corner of the room. It happened with terrifying, silent velocity. Weston didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. He simply materialized from the darkness, his hand clamped around the man's wrist, twisting it upward with a sickening crack. The suppressed pistol clattered to the floor. The assassin let out a muffled scream, but Weston's other hand was already at his throat. With a brutal, fluid motion, Weston drove the man backward, slamming him against the stone fireplace. The impact shook the room. Vivian watched in paralyzed horror as Weston systematically dismantled the threat. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution of raw, terrifying power. Weston's face was devoid of emotion, a blank mask of absolute violence. He struck the man precisely, efficiently, until the assassin slumped to the floor, unconscious and bleeding heavily onto the expensive rug. Weston stood over the body, his chest heaving slightly. He slowly straightened his cuffs. A single drop of blood stained his pristine white shirt. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Vivian, who was trembling violently against the table. The monster was out of the cage, and he was looking right at her. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Vivian squeezed her eyes shut, terrified of the violence still radiating from him. But the strike never came. Instead, Weston's large, warm hands gently cupped her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, checking her for injuries. His breathing was ragged now, the cold facade cracking. "Did he touch you?" Weston demanded, his voice a raw, terrifying growl that vibrated through her bones. "No," Vivian choked out, opening her eyes to see the absolute fury in his. "No, he didn't." Weston let out a long, shaky breath, his forehead dropping to rest gently against hers. It was an incredibly intimate, desperate gesture that completely unmoored her. The smell of copper blood mixed with his bergamot cologne. "I told you to stay in your room," he whispered fiercely, his grip on her face tightening slightly. "I cannot protect you if you wander into the dark." "Vivian, he was a Bianchi," she stuttered, tears finally falling. "He said they wanted to know who I really am." Weston pulled back, his eyes hardening, the vulnerability vanishing instantly. He looked at the unconscious man on the floor. "They know nothing, and they will learn nothing." He looked back at her, his gaze dropping to the heavy emerald necklace, then back to her eyes. "Are you ready?" "For what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To show them that you belong to me," Weston said, his voice cold as steel. "To show them that touching you is a death sentence." The Syndicate Gala was held in the grand atrium of the city's oldest museum, a cavernous space of marble columns, vaulted glass ceilings, and shadowed alcoves. It was a gathering of the city's true power brokers, politicians, judges, corporate titans, and the men who controlled the shadows beneath them. The armored SUV pulled up to the red carpet. The flash of paparazzi cameras, invited to document the legitimate facade of these men, exploded in the night. Inside the car, the air was thick with tension. Weston sat beside Vivian, radiating a cold, dangerous energy. He turned to her, his dark eyes sweeping over her illuminated features. "Remember," he instructed, his voice low, "you are not Vivian the waitress tonight. You are my wife. You do not look down. You do not step back. If someone approaches you, you look them in the eye and you let them see that you fear nothing, because you have the devil standing right beside you." Vivian swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded, terrified that her voice would betray her. The door opened. Weston stepped out first, ignoring the flashing cameras. He turned, offering his hand. Vivian took it. The moment her foot touched the pavement, he pulled her close, his hand resting firmly on the bare skin of her lower back. It was a possessive, territorial claim, broadcasted to every watching eye. They walked into the museum. The hum of conversation died down as they entered the grand ballroom, replaced by a tense, palpable silence. Every eye in the room turned toward them. Vivian felt exposed, as if the emerald silk were made of glass. "Head up," Weston murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. To an onlooker, it looked like an intimate, loving whisper. To Vivian, it was a lifeline. They moved through the crowd. Men in expensive tuxedos and women in dripping jewels parted for them like the Red Sea. Weston played his part flawlessly. He smiled a rare, terrifying expression that didn't reach his eyes and shook hands, but he never let Vivian move more than an inch from his side. His hand on her waist was a constant, burning reminder of the charade. An hour into the gala, the real test arrived. "Weston," a voice called out, smooth and cultured, but laced with underlying malice. Vivian felt Weston's muscles coil beneath his tuxedo jacket. They turned. Approaching them was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair, impeccably dressed, and possessing eyes as cold as a winter sea. It was Don Bianchi, the head of the rival family, the man whose soldier had nearly killed her hours ago. "Lorenzo," Weston replied, his voice a flat, dead calm. "I was surprised to hear you had taken a wife, Weston," Lorenzo Bianchi said, stopping a few feet away, his guards fanning out behind him. His cold eyes shifted to Vivian, dissecting her. "You always struck me as a man married only to his ambition. And to do it so quietly? It lacks your usual flair." "My personal life is not subject to your approval, Lorenzo," Weston countered smoothly. "No, but it is subject to the curiosity of the commission." Lorenzo smiled, a reptilian curving of his lips. He stepped closer to Vivian. "And who might this stunning creature be?" "She looks familiar. Do you have family in the city, my dear?" The question was a trap. It was a probe, digging for the weakness, searching for the crack in the facade. The memory of the assassin in the dining room flashed in Vivian's mind. "They want to know who you really are." Panic flared in her chest, but as Lorenzo stepped closer, trying to intimidate her, something inside Vivian snapped. She was tired of being terrified. She was tired of being a pawn. If she was going to survive the night, she had to become the armor Weston had dressed her in. She didn't step back. She tilted her chin up, meeting Lorenzo Bianchi's cold eyes with a defiant, steady glare. "My family is standing right beside me, Mr. Bianchi," Vivian said, her voice remarkably clear, echoing slightly in the tense quiet around them. "And Weston is quite protective of his own. I would suggest you remember that before you let your curiosity overstep your manners." The silence that followed was absolute. Lorenzo's smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shock, quickly masked by anger. No one spoke to a Don like that. Beside her, Vivian felt Weston stiffen, completely caught off guard by her audacity. But then, a low, dark chuckle rumbled in his chest. His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her flesh against him. "You'll have to forgive my wife, Lorenzo," Weston said, his eyes glittering with dangerous amusement. "She has little patience for pleasantries when she knows a man is fishing in dark waters. Enjoy the champagne." Weston didn't wait for a response. He turned Vivian smoothly and guided her away from the seething rival boss. Once they were safely secluded on a dark balcony overlooking the city skyline, Weston let go of her waist. He turned to face her, leaning against the stone balustrade. He looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time. "That was incredibly foolish," he said quietly, the night breeze ruffling his dark hair. "It worked, didn't it?" Vivian shot back, her adrenaline still spiking. He backed off. "You made yourself a bigger target," Weston replied. But there was no anger in his voice. There was something else. A profound, unsettling respect. He took a step toward her, invading her space, his dark eyes intensely focused on her face. "Who are you, Vivian?" "I'm the waitress you kidnapped," she whispered, her heart suddenly pounding for an entirely different reason as he stepped closer. "No," Weston said softly, reaching out to trace the line of her jaw with his thumb. "A waitress would have broken. You looked the devil in the eye and bared your teeth." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You are dangerous, Mrs. Rossi." For a moment, the charade fractured. The tension between them wasn't about survival. It was electric, heavy, and terrifyingly real. Vivian stared up at him, entirely captivated by the monster who had become her shield. The ride back to the compound was silent, but the atmosphere inside the SUV had fundamentally shifted. The cold, transactional distance between them was gone, replaced by a heavy, undeniable tension. Vivian could still feel the phantom heat of Weston's thumb tracing her jawline. Every time the car turned, their knees brushed, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. She was terrified of him, yes, but the gala had proved something else. She trusted him to keep her alive. When they arrived at the estate, the adrenaline crash hit Vivian like a physical wall. She was exhausted, her feet throbbing in the designer heels, the heavy emerald necklace feeling like a shackle again. As they entered the grand foyer, Elias was waiting, his face grim. "We have a problem," Elias said, ignoring Vivian completely and stepping close to Weston. The perimeter sweep found a breach near the north wall. They compromised the secondary server room. They were downloading files before the system locked them out. Weston's demeanor instantly snapped back to the cold, calculating kingpin. "Did they get the archives?" "We don't know yet." "I need you down there." Weston turned to Vivian, his expression hard. "Go to your room, lock the door. Do not let anyone in but Martha." He didn't wait for her to reply, disappearing down a stairwell with Elias, the air crackling with impending violence. Vivian stood alone in the foyer. The massive house felt ominous again. She started toward the east wing, but as she passed the heavy mahogany doors of Weston's private study, she noticed something. In his haste, he hadn't pulled the door completely shut. It was open a fraction of an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. Curiosity, fueled by the lingering adrenaline of the night, overrode her common sense. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it silently behind her. The study was vast, smelling of old paper, leather, and Weston's signature bergamot. She didn't turn on the lights, using the moonlight streaming through the massive windows to navigate. She didn't know what she was looking for. Perhaps proof that he was a monster. Perhaps proof that she was just a pawn. She moved to his massive mahogany desk. It was immaculately organized. She gently pulled the top drawer. Locked. The second drawer. Locked. She moved to a heavy antique credenza against the wall. The handle turned. Inside was a small, high-tech biometric safe, but the door was slightly ajar, its green light pulsing weakly. Elias had said they were breached. Perhaps Weston had been in here earlier, checking his most vital assets, and left it open in the chaos. Vivian's hands trembled as she pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside were stacks of banded cash, passports with Weston's face and different names, and a thick, manila folder lying on top. The folder had no label. Holding her breath, Vivian picked it up and opened it on the desk, tilting it toward the moonlight. The breath was punched from her lungs. It wasn't financial records. It wasn't hit lists. It was her. Staring up from the folder were dozens of photographs. Vivian at her college graduation, smiling in her cheap gown. Vivian walking out of the diner where she worked before L'Aurora, wearing a faded winter coat. Vivian sitting on the fire escape of her cramped apartment, reading a book. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her throat. She flipped through the papers beneath the photos. They were financial ledgers, tracking anonymous deposits made to her landlord, to her university to cover the scholarship she thought she had won on merit. There were surveillance logs detailing her daily routines, noting the men she dated, the places she shopped. The dates on the documents went back 5 years. He hadn't chosen her at random in the restaurant. The wife claim wasn't a desperate improvisation to save a bystander. He had known her. He had been watching her, tracking her, funding her life from the shadows for years. "Oh my God," Vivian whispered into the silent room, her hands shaking so violently she dropped the folder. The photos scattering across the dark wood like fallen leaves. A profound sense of betrayal and terror washed over her. Weston wasn't her protector. He was a stalker. He was a puppeteer who had manipulated her entire existence from afar, only to drag her into his violent world when it suited him. The moment on the balcony, the feeling of connection, it was all built on a massive, terrifying lie. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. The lights blazed to life, blinding her. Vivian spun around, throwing her arm up to shield her eyes. Standing in the doorway was Weston. His jacket was gone, his tie loosened. He looked from Vivian, pale and trembling in her emerald dress, down to his desk, where her photographs lay scattered under the harsh light. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening, and loaded with the gravity of a detonating bomb. Weston didn't yell. He didn't reach for a weapon. His eyes simply went dead, dropping the mask he had worn all night, revealing a profound, exhausted sorrow beneath. "You shouldn't be in here, Vivian," he said softly, closing the door behind him and locking it. "Don't come any closer," Vivian screamed, her voice cracking with terror. She scrambled backward, her hip slamming painfully against the edge of the heavy desk. She snatched a heavy, brass letter opener from the desktop, holding it out in front of her with shaking hands. It was a pathetic weapon against a man who could snap her neck with a thought, but it was all she had. Weston stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the letter opener, then up to her wide, terrified eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked defeated. "Put that down, Vivian. You're going to hurt yourself," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You've been watching me." She choked out, tears spilling over her lashes, ruining the perfect makeup from the gala. She gestured wildly to the scattered photos. "For years. You paid my rent. You paid for my school. Why? Are you some kind of psychopath? Was the restaurant just a setup to finally kidnap me?" Weston closed his eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. When he opened them, the cold, impenetrable Mafia Boss was gone. The man standing before her looked old, burdened by a weight she couldn't comprehend. "The restaurant was not a setup," he said slowly, deliberately. "It was an ambush. But they weren't there for me, Vivian. They were there for you." Vivian froze, the letter opener trembling in her grip. "That makes no sense. I'm a waitress. I have nothing. You have blood," Weston corrected, his voice dropping to a heavy whisper. He slowly crossed the room. Ignoring the weapon pointed at him, he stopped at the desk, looking down at the photo of her college graduation. "You never knew your father, did you?" Vivian swallowed hard. "He died when I was a baby. A car accident. My mother never talked about him." "Your mother lied to keep you alive," Weston said brutally. "Your father didn't die in a car accident. He was murdered in an alleyway by Lorenzo Bianchi. His name was Arthur Vance. He was the head of this syndicate before me. He was my mentor. He pulled me out of the gutters and taught me everything." Vivian's mind spun, rejecting the information. No, that's impossible. We were poor. We had nothing, because he wanted it that way," Weston explained, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "When Lorenzo made his move, Arthur knew the syndicate would fracture. He knew Lorenzo would hunt down his bloodline to ensure no one could ever claim the throne or the hidden assets Arthur had secured. So, he hid you. He gave you a new name, put you in a miserable apartment, and made you invisible." He stepped closer, carefully reaching out to gently push the brass letter opener down. Vivian was too stunned to resist. "Before he died, he made me swear an oath," Weston continued, the raw emotion finally bleeding into his voice. "He made me swear on my life that I would watch over you from the shadows, that I would never let the life touch you. I paid for your school. I kept you out of the worst neighborhoods. But I could never speak to you. I could never let you know I existed, because my proximity was a death sentence." Vivian slumped against the desk, her legs trembling. The puzzle pieces were violently snapping together, forming a terrifying picture. The men at the restaurant. Lorenzo finally found out the bloodline didn't die, Weston said grimly. "He tracked you to Laura. He was going to take you from that room, torture you for the location of your father's vault, and then put a bullet in your head. So you claimed me. It was the only rule Lorenzo couldn't break in a room full of witnesses," Weston said, his voice thick with frustration. "The commission law is absolute. A Don's wife is untouchable. By claiming you, I put my own empire, my own life, on the line to act as your shield. If the commission finds out it was a lie to protect the Vance heir, they will strip me of my title and we both die." Vivian stared at him, the magnitude of his sacrifice washing over her. He hadn't stalked her. He had been her silent, invisible guardian angel, bound by an oath to a dead man, and 2 nights ago, he had thrown away his own safety to pull her out of the fire. Why didn't you just tell me? She whispered, dropping the letter opener completely. Because if you knew the truth, you would run, Weston said, stepping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. And out there, without my protection, you wouldn't survive a day. I needed you angry at me. I needed you terrified of me. Because fear keeps you inside these walls. Vivian looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the exhaustion and the desperate need to protect her. The monster was just a man, holding back a tide of violence to keep a promise. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the estate was shattered. A massive, concussive boom echoed through the floorboards, rattling the windows in their frames. The lights flickered and died, plunging the room into absolute darkness, save for the pale moonlight. Instantly, the shrill, deafening wail of the perimeter alarms began to scream. Weston grabbed her in the dark, his arms pulling her tight against his chest. The breach, Weston swore viciously in the dark, pulling a handgun from his holster. Lorenzo didn't care about the files. It was a distraction to disable the grid. They're here. The compound descended into absolute chaos. The sound of heavy automatic gunfire erupted from the front gates, echoing through the massive halls like rolling thunder. Weston didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vivian's hand, his grip tight, and dragged her out of the study and into the darkened corridor. Emergency red lights pulsed rhythmically, casting demonic shadows on the walls. Elias! Weston roared over his radio as they ran toward the center of the house. Status. They brought an army boss. Elias's voice crackled through the earpiece, accompanied by the deafening chatter of a machine gun. They breached the main gate. They're pushing toward the east wing. They know she's here. Hold the grand staircase. Do not let them reach the second floor, Weston ordered. Pushing Vivian into a small, windowless security alcove, he turned to her, his face a mask of terrifying resolve in the red emergency light. He pulled a small, heavy key from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. Beneath the wine cellar in the basement, there is a reinforced door. This key opens it. It leads to a tunnel that exits a mile past the perimeter into the woods. A car is waiting there. Get in, drive south, and do not stop until you hit the coast. Vivian stared at the key, then up at his face. What about you? I am going to hold them here, Weston said, racking the slide of his weapon. Lorenzo wants the bloodline dead. As long as I am breathing, he doesn't get past this foyer. He was telling her he was going to die. He was going to sacrifice himself in a hail of bullets to honor an oath to her father, a man she didn't even remember. A profound, searing heat bloomed in Vivian's chest, burning away the last remnants of the terrified waitress. As Weston turned to leave, to walk into the slaughterhouse, Vivian grabbed his arm. No, she said. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was solid, echoing with the authority of the bloodline she had just discovered. Weston turned back, his eyes wide with frantic urgency. Vivian, there is no time to argue. Go. If I run, Lorenzo will hunt me until the day I die. He will never stop, Vivian said, stepping out of the alcove, her emerald dress trailing behind her like dark water. And you will die for a ghost. I won't let you do that. You don't know what you're doing, Weston growled, trying to push her back. I know exactly what I'm doing, Vivian countered, looking him dead in the eye. I am Arthur Vance's daughter. And tonight, I am your wife. We don't run. Before Weston could stop her, she turned and sprinted toward the control panel in the command center they had passed earlier. The room was empty, the guards mobilized to the front. The main screens were dark, but the analog emergency backup system was lit. Vivian! Weston shouted, sprinting after her. The vault! She yelled over the gunfire. You said my father hit a vault. Where is it? Weston grabbed her shoulders, spinning her around. It's beneath the central courtyard. Why? Because Lorenzo doesn't want me dead as much as he wants what's in that vault, Vivian said rapidly, her mind working with a terrifying clarity she didn't know she possessed. If he kills me, he never gets the code. We use it. She slammed her hand down on the compound's PA system, broadcasting her voice across the entire estate, both inside and out. Lorenzo Bianchi! Vivian's voice boomed over the gunfire, halting the chaos for a fraction of a second. This is Vivian Vance, heir to the syndicate. Weston stared at her, utterly stunned by her transformation. She was standing in the red light, diamonds around her neck, commanding a war zone. You want my father's vault, Lorenzo? she continued, her voice dripping with venom. "I am standing over it. If your men take one more step into this house, I will detonate the incendiary charges beneath the courtyard. The vault, the ledger, the money, all of it burns. And you leave with nothing but the war you started." Silence fell over the compound. The gunfire outside abruptly ceased. It was a massive bluff. There were no incendiary charges. But Lorenzo didn't know that. He only knew that the daughter of Arthur Vance was as ruthless as her father. "Hold your fire!" Lorenzo's voice echoed faintly from the courtyard below. Vivian looked at Weston. Her chest was heaving. She had just bought them time, but the standoff couldn't last forever. Weston didn't speak. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing with a mixture of awe and dark pride, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate kiss. It was raw, bruising, and tasted of adrenaline and gunpowder. It was real. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "You are magnificent," he breathed. He keyed his radio. "Elias, the Bianchis are stalled. Flank them from the armory tunnels. Take Lorenzo alive, bury the rest." The trap snapped shut. Lorenzo, hesitating over the threat to the vault, had allowed his men to remain exposed in the open courtyard. Weston's hidden reserves poured out from the subterranean tunnels, entirely surrounding the rival crew. The firefight that followed was brief, brutal, and decisive. When the sun finally began to rise over the tree line, casting a pale, cold light over the smoke-filled estate, the war was over. Lorenzo Bianchi was on his knees in the gravel, his empire shattered, staring up at the balcony where Weston and Vivian stood together. Vivian looked down at the ruin of the night. Her emerald dress was torn, her hands were smeared with dirt, and she had never felt more powerful. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't a pawn, Weston's arm wrapped securely around her waist. This time, it wasn't a charade for an audience, and it wasn't a cage to protect her. It was an anchor. She leaned into his strength, knowing the truth of who she was and who he was. "What happens now?" she asked softly, watching the guards haul Lorenzo away. Weston looked down at her, the monster tamed, the guardian finally at peace. "Whatever you want, Mrs. Rossi," he murmured, kissing the crown of her head. "The city is yours. The hardest choices we make are often the ones that terrify us the most." Vivian's journey from a powerless waitress to a queen of the underworld wasn't born of a desire for power, but from a desperate need to survive, ultimately discovering the profound strength hidden within her own bloodline. Sometimes, the monsters we fear are the only ones capable of guarding our truth. If this story gripped you, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more thrilling, dramatic narratives that explore the dark, hidden corners of fate and resilience.